Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. And it is my pleasure to moderate this panel today, which will explore and discuss the links between violent extremism and organized crime in the Western Balkans. So both violent extremism and organized crime are not new issues and threats in the Western Balkans. The region's history of conflict and inter-ethnic tensions has led to the emergence of far-right extremist groups. And over the past 2 decades, there has been a good amount of studies that looked into the causes, manifestations, and some that even attempted to measure the magnitude of the issue across the Western Balkans. On the other hand, Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and our Observatory for Southeastern Europe has been conducting research on illicit economies in the Western Balkans for over 7 years now, strengthening the knowledge base on criminal trends and criminal markets, and strengthening resilience against these threats. We do know that both violent extremism and organized crime present significant security threats in the Western Balkan region, with far-reaching implications. But most of the time, we'll look into these threats separately. Studies on the nexus between extremism and crime have mainly focused on religious extremism and terrorism, while interactions and linkages between violent extremism in its broader sense and organized crime remain largely under-researched. But is there, and what is the nexus between violent extremism and organized crime? This is the issue that we wanted to tackle. With the support of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime and our observatory has been carrying out a project to improve understanding of these links. And over the past year, our team and team of researchers have conducted research examining these connections. In this session, our team, that I will shortly present, will share key preliminary findings from 3 separate research projects that have been carried out. The first one is identifying and analyzing the links between violent extremism and organized crime. The second is exploring the financial aspect of this nexus, including how extremist activities are funded. And the third one, understanding the intersections between military training, political extremism, and organized crime. So with us today are Ruggero Scatura, Senior Analyst at the Global Initiative, and the first author of the first report, which is actually a baseline study, which is probing the links between violent extremism and organized crime. Sasha Đorđević, Senior Analyst at the Global Initiative and Coordinator for Serbia and Montenegro, who is authoring the report on financing of extremism in the Western Balkans. Almedina Dodić, Project Assistant at the Global Initiative, who will be presenting on behalf of the author, who unfortunately wasn't able to join us today, Fabian Zila, who is also a Senior Fellow at the Global Initiative and who is working on the report that is examining the links between political extremism and organized crime, especially in relation to radicalized military and foreign fighters. Almedina has been assisting the research team and closely monitoring the research process. Thank you all. And just before we start, I would just like to invite our audience to please participate in the discussions that will follow. Please feel free to post your comments. We want to hear your opinions and feedback. And please write your questions in the Q&A box that you see on your screens. After the presentations, we will have some time to answer them. Without further ado, I would like to start by giving floor to Ruggero Scatura, the co-author, first author, in fact, of the report, which is probing the links between violent extremism and organized crime. Ruggero, how did you and your co-author examine these links? How did you probe and prove them? And what were your main findings? Please, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vanya, and welcome also everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Yes, as Vanya has just introduced the main the topic actually of this presentation, which is also the title of this upcoming report, which by the way is going to be published by the end of this year. is beyond ideology, probing indeed the links between violent extremism and organized crime in the Western Balkans. As Vanya said, this is a sort of like a first attempt, an attempt to understand whether interconnections, interrelations, or the nexus between these two specific groups, these two specific phenomena exist, first of all, in the Western Balkan 6, and if then exists, then to what extent and how it manifests. We can go to the next slide. So since the very beginning, so when we basically started this research journey, we started, of course, with sort of like a literature. We started studying whatever resource we could come across talking about exactly this topic. And since the very beginning, we in a way identified some gaps in literature. We saw that there is, of course, a lot on violent extremism as such, the connection between, for example, political and religious extremism, violence and terrorism, particularly, also at the policy level. But what we saw since the very beginning is the fact that there is very limited research in English, but also in local languages on the nexus between, on the one side, violent extremism, be it political or religious, and any form of transnational organized crime, of course, with our focus in the Western Balkan region. Yeah. So with this sort of like knowledge gap in mind, we started developing our own way of studying this phenomenon. And so the goal of creating an analytical tool, we sort of like establish a sort of like a monitoring mechanism, largely, I would say, relying on the methodology of the Organized Crime Index, which is a product of the Global Initiative, in order to monitor the interactions between different actors with common purposes, meaning how do violent extremism on the one side and organized crime groups on the other side interact in order to pursue a specific goal. Of course, the goal of creating this analytical tool was also to create some sort of mechanism that would be then reiterated in the future, with the possibility to have like multiple temperature checks in the course of the next years as well. So in a way, something that would make us able to regularly update any risk assessment that we come up with. An ultimate goal, still on the rationale of this study, our goal, in fact, was to, in a way, go beyond these conventional and monolithic understandings of terrorism / violent extremism on the one side and organized crime on the other. Also, in a way, indirectly, with the goal of promoting cooperation among entities and departments within law enforcement, but also at the international level that typically work in silos when approaching the phenomena. Thank you. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. So a little bit on the research process. I'm not going to go through this working definition, which, by the way, you're going to find in the annex when the report is going to be published. But importantly here, one thing that is key is that given that, again, as we have to stick in a way to our mandate at GI-TOC, for us, it was important to understand the phenomenon through the lens of organized crime. And this was in a little bit of a limitation, also in understanding what kind of actors we could include, especially when it comes to violent extremism. So we had to come up with our own working definition of religious extremism and far-right extremism as well. We can go now to the next slide. So once we identified our working definition and created our working definition of violent extremist groups, we came up with a sort of like a methodology in order to understand the nature and the magnitude of the power of these groups. And to do so, we assessed their nature and their identity based on these three indicators that you see in the slide. So the level of violence, the access to weapon, and their territorial control. We mimicking pretty much the methodology developed for the C index. We then had our own consultants on the ground, but I'm going to come back to the research projects in a little bit. So basically, we asked our consultants and our researchers on the ground conducting fieldwork to after conducting interviews and doing the fieldwork, to have their own assessment from 1 to 10, meaning from very low to very high for each of this indicator. Now, once we had on this side of, I would say, of an hypothetical board, the violent extremist groups also assessed based on the 3 indicators, we then had to introduce our own working definition of organized crime actors, again, following the methodology of the OC index, which identifies multiple different organized crime actors, ranging from mafia-style criminal networks, state-embedded actors, and foreign actors. These are the ones that we selected for our study. So we had on the one side violent extremist actors, on the other side organized crime actors, and then the goal of this exercise was basically to understand the extent, if first, and then the extent to which these groups, in a way, cooperate or interact in a series of criminal markets. And these are listed here, the criminal markets that we have analyzed, identified first and then analyzed. So arms trafficking, drugs, extortion and loan sharking, human trafficking, migrant smuggling, money laundering, and cyber-enabled crimes. If you click, then exactly. And in order to understand the level of interaction, again, thanks to fieldwork and extensive semi-structured interviews, but also collection of court cases, I'm going to get back to that in a little bit, we have also assessed the level of interactions, again, using the same sort of methodology, so from very low to very high. Next slide. A little bit on the data collection. As said, we have conducted, first of all, desk research, a literature review in English, but also in local languages of academic sources, international, national degree literature, media reports, regional and national policy reports. And then also we tried as much as possible to collect court cases of either violent extremist individuals convicted for crimes related to serious and organized crime, or vice versa. So meaning known or convicted, formerly convicted criminals also involved in acts of violent extremism, be it for terrorism or any other violent act related to politics and so on. And then we also, of course, had 2 rounds actually of semi-structured interviews with the list of stakeholders that you can see here. Next slide. A little bit on the scoring process, meaning, so why this? So it is important, it was important for us to, once we had assessed the level of interaction, we also had to come up with our own way of understanding how that interaction was solid, or at least significant enough for us to be included in the study, and then ultimately also in the final report. So we came up with our own hierarchy, our own way of sort of like categorizing this level of interaction on top of the indicators that I showed you before. So starting from the bottom, for us, the interaction between violent extremist actors and organized crime actors existed. Well, if, for example, and this was like the least sort of like threshold, the lowest threshold for us to say, okay, there exists interaction. And that was when we had 3 relevant interviewees confirming the existence of this specific nexus between group A and group B. If better than this, we actually had the possibility to have the published media investigation showing that this nexus exists, plus a relevant interviewee confirming that that interaction took place. And then in the best case scenarios, we had confirmation by a court that independently decided on this specific interaction and nexus. We can go to the next slides. Yes, the group features. These are features that we have identified, I would say, across the different violent extremist actors that we have identified, regardless of whether they are far-right or religious violent extremist groups or individuals. So first of all, the size and the degrees of leadership are changing depending on the nature and history of the group, but associations typically comprise between 6 and 20 young men, which in a way also opens for a little bit of a digression. I'm not going to go into there, but it's also very interesting to look at the phenomenon from a gender also perspective, toxic masculinity, and so on. And in general, all these groups are characterized by clear leadership and structure. We came across multiple groups, for example, that over less than, for example, 2 years, they changed names, colors, badges, whatever. But at the end of the day, the group was always the same members, the same guys, the same people were always part of the same groups. Point two, groups have mutating modus operandi over time, and the degree of violence changes depending on the local context and the territorial control that we have measured in the first place. Also, the degree of connection with deviant factions of institutions and law enforcement authorities. There is here, for example, a huge difference between how violent extremists so far right, violent extremist groups operate, for example, in Serbia, in particular in Belgrade, and how instead they operate, for example, in a country like Albania. And then, of course, also it's important to say that the level of interaction and also the way the groups operate really depends on the criminal markets in which the group is active. For example, again, in Serbia, we saw that most far-right wing violent extremists, for example, are particularly active in provision of muscles for politicians, or in extortion, or in protection racketeering, markets that in a way require a rather high degree of violence as well. The same, for example, cannot be said for Albania or Montenegro as well, where mainly the main criminal markets in which violent extremist groups are involved are more, for example, money laundering, or in very specific cases also, for example, drug production and trafficking, which are in a way criminal markets which really in a way do not function well if violent extremism, if a high degree of violence is involved, because higher degrees of violence in a way require higher degrees of attention, or attract higher degrees of attention from law enforcement authorities, which are bad for business. And then the last point, common features across the board is the setting up of NGOs and other forms of association for financing activities and money laundering. But this is more a topic that my colleague Sasha will cover in a little bit. And then we can go to the last slide. So the matrix of organized crime and violent extremism relationship, this is a sort of like an evidence-based analysis. In general, international and regional organizations such as the DC, UNICRI, Europol, which have addressed the interaction between violent extremism and organized crime, often assume that the relationship between the actors involved is always positive, meaning that it generally implies cooperation and coordination to meet specific financial or political goals. For example, according to the NODC, there is an increasing recognition that terrorists can benefit from organized crime, and that the confluence of criminal and terrorist actors enable them to gain stronger capacities to threat peace, security, and economic development. However, what we have seen in the Balkans, and hence the evidence-based analysis, suggests that the nature of the interaction between the two actors are very diverse and differs a lot in terms of quality, type, and also durability. The initial distinction to consider is the type of cooperation between organizations. In some scenarios, organizations may have aligned actually strategic goals, but differed in their motivations. For instance, both might aim to destabilize a particular area, but a criminal organization might see it as a chance to advance, an opportunity to boost profits, while a violent extremist group, for example, might view it as a chance to advance political or religious agenda, or even both, in case of overlaps between political and religious agenda. The example of two leaders of the criminal group operating in northern Kosovo is particularly relevant. In fact, while for Veselinovic, the destabilization of Kosovo was key for guaranteeing impunity for his trafficking-related activities, Radojcic ties with the Serbian government and influence also over the Serb minority communities in northern Kosovo suggest that he was more likely pursuing a political agenda. On the other hand, when both groups publicly, for example, align their strategic goals and encourage their supporters to cooperate, this reflects also ideological coordination. For example, the alleged ISIS members in North Macedonia have relied on a vast number of like-minded people or supporters of the local criminal milieu to carry out their illicit activities, such as organized robberies, for instance. As an alternative, even without shared strategic objectives, groups might still form transnational or transactional or logistical partnerships and exchange also resources or services, activities that, for example, are needed to set up NGOs for terrorism financing that we have identified in Montenegro and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Operational collaboration can also occur through joint criminal or violent activities. Combining these cooperation types with other factors, such as the duration of the cooperation and the extent also of the resource sharing, allows us also to categorize the quality of the cooperation into low-end and high-end. Starting from the latter, so high-end cooperation involves definitely sharing human resources and military knowledge, and often includes also joint operations. For example, this has been observed in Serbia, when analyzing the nexus between the Janitsari hooligan group supporting Partizan and the drug trafficking organization, both led by Veliko Belivuk at some point in time, with him being really the nexus, the existing nexus, the manifestation of the nexus between the two groups. And this level of cooperation, of course, requires significant trust and resources investment to integrate some organizational function, typically seen in long-term collaborations with shared strategic goals. In that case of Veliko Belivuk, control over the stadium, the Partizan stadium, and the hooligans realm also, in a way, coincided with control over the drug business in Belgrade and beyond. On the other hand, low-end cooperation is typically short-term and focused on specific tactical goals involving very limited merging of organizational functions. And this has been observed, for example, in the context of an analysis of far-right extremist groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina. For example, the Sveti Georgi Lončari. In fact, in the recent past, the group has often engaged with organized crime actors in illicit trade, without really, however, aligning any strategic objective. On the opposite side, and I'm about to conclude, of this spectrum of interactions, we have to consider also contentious relationship that in many cases are also the reality, especially when the two actors are either competing over resources in a specific territory, or when violent extremism is perceived by criminal actors as a threat to profit, something that I was mentioned also earlier. On the one side, the research has really not produced any finding on the first scenario, but the second option is particularly dependent on the type, as said, of the illicit market where the criminal actors under analysis are rather active. As I said before, in Serbia, we observed that violent extremist groups analyzed are often engaged in organized crime activities, which, because of the local context, require a high degree of reliance on violence and threats. Drug street dealing, extortion, protection, racketeering. In Albania, instead, leaders of organized crime groups active in cocaine trafficking and money laundering, which are, by the way, the two most pervasive criminal markets in the country, according to the OC Index, are particularly reluctant to team up with extremist groups for any reason, as these are rather perceived to attract too much attention from police and also secret services, actually jeopardizing the illicit businesses. To conclude, this is not new because there are a number of examples from across the globe of unfruitful, I would say, associations between organized crime and violent extremist groups. From narco-terrorism perpetrated by the Cartel of Medellin in collaboration with the United Self-Defense of Defenders of Colombia, the decline of Cosa Nostra as well, which, for example, perhaps helps to better understand the argument. Once leader of the international heroin trade, the organized crime group from Sicily benefited extremely from high levels of impunity for basically half a century. However, from the early 1980s, under the leadership of the Corleonesi, the mafia group really embarked on a series of terrorist acts, often teaming up with elements of neo-fascist Italian paramilitary groups. But after more than 10 years of massacres and bombings and attracting, and also the display of violence, Italian law enforcement really had to react to such threats posed to national security. So hundreds of seizures, arrests led then not only to the downsizing of the group, but also dramatically impacted the role played by Cosa Nostra in lucrative criminal markets, underscoring ultimately how the alliance with violent extremisms and the adoption of a terrorist modus operandi really constituted an organizational suicide. And this was my last slide. Thank you very much. Over to you, Vanya.
Thank you, Ruggero. No, this was really fascinating to hear. Thank you for sharing with us these first findings. It was really interesting to see this metrics of relationship and concluding with comparative examples and what we can get out of it. I'm sure that the audience will appreciate it, also hearing a little bit more about the methodology and the research process. I can see already questions for you, but please, I would just ask for everyone's patience. We would address these questions at the end. So I would just like to quickly move to the next presentation, Sasha. Now we will delve a little bit more into the money flows, right? Please tell us how extremist organizations finance their activities, and I'm sure there will be an interesting things to say about the intersections between licit and illicit money and how it is flowing into the activities of the extremist groups. Over to you, Sasha.
Thank you, Vanya. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you that you actually joined the webinar and for 1 hour and listen us and our preliminary findings. So basically, my main topic today is about financing extremism in the Western Balkans, and this research is a follow-up of the research that Ruggero presented before. And during this presentation, I will try to answer like 3 main questions. Maybe you can go to the next slide. So basically what you can expect in this presentation. So the first question is what we aim during this research. So the second, how we actually conducted the research, and the 3 question, what we find out during the research process. So basically, this is the 3 main questions like that I will try to answer during this presentation. So there are basically 3 main aims of the research. So this research, as you can see on the slide, try to investigate how extremist actors in the Western Balkans organize and finance their operations. So basically on the 3 different levels. So the first level is how they raise funds and determine whether these funds actually originate from illicit or illicit sources. The second question is basically, the second topic is how extremist-related actors move funds nationally, but also internationally. And the third question, which is actually one of the most difficult during our research process, is basically how extremists use funds by assessing whether they are for operational or organizational financing. So basically our activities targeting basically some specific operations, or they are more connected with organizational development of one specific groups. So the next slide. So basically, in our methodology, we try to have like a level of analysis approach, and basically we have, like you can see on this slide, indicators concerning raising fund and indicators moving funds, and basically this research use the findings on the first research that Ruggero presented, And from this mapping exercise, probably you remember that was at the beginning of his presentation, we actually choose like 16 individuals and 16 groups that actually have connections with violent extremism and organized crime. And actually after that, we like this case study. So basically these individuals or groups presented one case study, and we tried for each of that groups to find out how they raise funds and moving funds. And we can see different, so there are different indicators, like for the raising fund. For example, this is external sponsorship and extremist patronage. That was very quite usual for Salafi jihadist groups in the Western Balkans. For example, self-financing and legal business, but also illicit business as crime was quite useful for far-right and right-wing groups in the Western Balkans. When we find out what are the ways of raising funds, we also try to understand how these actors move funds internationally and at the national level. And basically we try to understand, are the ways to formal financial sector, which means like banks, or it's usual like a cash movements, or they use some money services businesses like Western Union or like MoneyGram, or there is any role of digital assets in the different transactions. So basically this was the level of analysis approach. And as I said, the next slide. So basically we selected from the first study, from the mapping of extremist related entities, we selected 16 entities, and you can see on this slide. So we also try, when we choose the sample, when we define sample, we try to be very balanced to basically identify those organizations that actually have no or very low links with the organized crime, but also those who have high level of interaction with organized crime. And ideally, we actually also wanted to choose 2 organizations or individuals from each country in the region that represent different perspectives, one from the religious standpoint and another form from the far right or right-wing perspective. So basically these are the groups that we selected, and most of them were active in the last 10 years. Sometimes what we also identified during our research process that some organization at one point started to be active. Basically, when you look, for example, into the social media activities, and I don't know, for example, there was a time gap of 6 months, but after that they started to again started activities, especially on Instagram and TikTok, but also on some other social media like is Facebook. So basic about in the end about the data collection, the whole process of data collection was divided into 3 phases. The first phase was basically desk research or analysis of different sources, and in this we actually try to basically build our analysis on the case law and media reporting, and to find out again the balance to have objective picture of what's going on with financing of extremist actors in the Western Balkans. In the second phase, we actually have semi-structured interviews, so expert interviews with law enforcement, anti-terrorism and national security units. And you can see, for example, that we actually have 46 expert interviews, and we also again try to be very balanced. So from law enforcement we have 12 interviews. From media, especially investigative journalists that follow this topic for a long time, we have 11 journalists, but also we include civil society, academia, and expert. In that way, we have 10 interviews. For this topic, we also contacted financial intelligence units in the Western Balkans that usually operate in the Ministry of Finance within the governments, and we have 5 interviews in that context. We also have talks with the private sector, especially with people from the banks. In total, as I said, there was almost 50 interviews that actually we tried to fill the gaps, but also confirm some of the research findings from the desk research. And in the third phase, which is still ongoing, so basically information about extreme related, we try to identify all legal entities that are connected with these groups from public records, and we use also software called Sayari that basically create charts and link based on ownership and based on the name, address, and public records data, connect different entities, different legal entities. So basically, we also use this software to basically understand the companies and their budgets and their flow connected with extremist related actors. So basically, I will explain in one of the case later, like example. So the main aim basically is to access to global commercial financial information. So, and in the end, to help us to uncover risk to financial crime, and are those, because we also saw that some of the extremist related actors are under sanctions by the US or the UK government or the EU. So we also try to understand what is the impact of that. So this is about like the research. So what are the main findings? So please, next slide. So you can see, so basically what we understand that religious extremism and far-right groups have like quite different ways of financing, and the overall, like the global, the overall research finding is that basically that the financing is complex, especially on the far-right scene. So regarding raising fund and religious extremism, so actually we cover almost all Salafi supporters in the Western Balkans, and from the research we understand that basically they have different methods of financing in the last 20 years, 30 years basically. So when Salafi supported and the Salafism's rose in the Western Balkan, that was during the 90s and 2000s, most of the finance come from the Arab worlds, countries from the Arab worlds, like through like different sponsorship. So it was like external sponsorship, but that actually changed during the peak of conflict in Iraq and Syria between 2012 and 2017. That actually we have like different methods of financing, which is self-financing. Basically that members of these groups actually use their own money to for example, to pay for travel to Syria and Iraq, but also they have like extreme patronage, especially from the Islamic State, and they also use identity-based support networks that actually also have like two different non-profit organizations that were not only located in the Western Balkans but also in some Western European countries. And we understand from that research that Austria was particularly important, especially Vienna and Graz. And through these like fundraising events, they also funded money for example, for the red trip into Syria or Iraq, but also like to promote religious beliefs in the Western Balkans. After 2007, after the war, actually, because of the intervention and everything, started to like slowing down. We have like the Salafi supporters are still active in the Western Balkans, but they actually changed the way of their behavior and also changed the way of their financing. And more or less what we understand that in the period after 2017, more Salafi supporters are financing based on their own sources. There is no like external sponsorship or patronage, and that's why the main members, they are still active, especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But the main method of financing is self-financing. About moving funds, we actually understand we gather a lot of data between 2012 and 2017, and even also for now, that basically two main methods of moving funds will usually cash movements. So cash transactions, like on the field without any like scrutiny from the banks or from the authorities in the Ministry of Finance or national security, etc. So basically, this is way how they do. And the second way was basically using money service businesses, especially Western Union and MoneyGram, that and they're actually using clear account to transfer money, for example, from Austria, Germany, or Luxembourg to the Western Balkan countries. So this is like base. After that, like after 2017, we can also use that because of self-financing. Formal financial sector is quite used, especially through banks. And we also saw like an example of crowdfunding that was identified in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We actually, what is also different between when we compare Salafi with far-right groups, that actually illicit sources are not like the top source of funding Salafi groups in the Western Balkans. There was only one example coming from Kosovo when one group actually was engaged in criminal activities. It was about robberies, and basically when they sell like expensive jewelry, they use that money for promoting their idea or to travel to Syria. Other groups, basically for the Salafi, there was not so many examples that they were involved in organized crime, especially in serious organized crime. The situation with the far-right groups is completely different. So we can see that especially high members or leaders and high position members and also supporters of different far-right groups in the Western Balkans are basically, they have like their own businesses, and because of connections with the politics and the political parties, they have a lot of funds from public procurements and with the different businesses with the state or with the state-owned enterprises. And when we actually look into different like contracts, and we saw that especially in Serbia and Montenegro, those groups have contracts with state-owned enterprises in energy sector. So basically those companies that deal with electricity, with distribution of electricity and management of electricity. Other part of the groups are also using illicit businesses and crime. And more or less, Roger already explained, so that, for example, some groups from Serbia are connected with the drug trafficking and extortion, and basically they also use those activities to transparent, for example, ultranational messages, or in the context of Serbia, like to promote the idea of Kosovo is still part of Serbia. And also we have like external sponsorship, which is also coming from the state. So because of these different ways of funding sources for the far-right groups, like the moving funds is also quite different. So we can see that the banks, as part of the formal financial sector, are quite usual stuff. And basically, when we look into the companies and the banks where these groups actually have like companies connected with these groups have accounts, more or less we can see that same banks are appearing over and over again. Again, that's especially in connections with the legal business and also investment. But for the illicit business, we also have like a similar pattern approach, like for the Salafi group, which is like a cash movement. There are some like indication, but not proof, that some of the far-right groups in the Western Balkans also use digital assets. And those groups that have like the highest level of connections with organized crime, they also have like involved money laundering. But during our research, we actually understand that those typologies of money laundering are quite rudimentary. So basically through real estate or like or real estate construction, but also through luxury. One important topic for this preliminary research finding is basically that the Western Balkan region is not monolith. So it's basically we can see that different level of intensity of links between organized crime and violent extremist groups is different in the countries, and the threat is basically not the same. And in the last slide, you can see that those countries that are particularly affected with religious extremism and those like with the far right groups. I think this is because this is very important when government trying to introduce some policy solutions how to address this issue, because what we saw during our research that basically there are not so many investigation about like financing extremism in the Western Balkans, and this is one of the issues. Next slide. So basically, I already said more of this stuff. So I will, if you have any questions, so feel free to ask. So thank you for your attention.
Great. Thank you, Sasha. Again, we are trying to, we know we have limited time. I'm sure there will be questions. There is so many things to still share and discuss, because topic is indeed very, very fascinating. Now we heard about the raise of funds, how the funds are moving. Examples were there to kind of put everything in the perspective, and so we can really get the better picture of it. So now I will just quickly move to the third presentation, our third study, third research that is being conducted. Almedina, please, over to you about examination of like what are the links between political extremism and organized crime? How is radicalized military associated with political extremism?
Thank you, Vanya. Good afternoon to everyone. As Vanya mentioned at the beginning of this session, the author of this study is our colleague Fabian Gila, but who used to some personal commitments couldn't join us today to present the findings himself. So in case you have any questions during or after the presentation, we will of course do our best to answer them. If we cannot provide immediate answers, then we will follow up with you via email. So this study, we can go to the next slide, please. This study applied qualitative methods, including interviews and case studies, to gather detailed insights into the connections between military training, organized crime, and political extremism in the Western Balkans. So the research involved 4 main steps. That was the collecting data, conducting interviews, analyzing this information, and the last one is the drafting of the report that is still an ongoing process. For this purpose, we engaged local experts in each of the countries. Around 80 interviews were conducted with a wide range of stakeholders, such as former fighters, returned foreign fighters, active law enforcement, intelligence officers, NGO representatives, investigative journalists, religious leaders, experts also in criminology and extremism studies in the Western Balkans. So in all 6 Western Balkan countries. In this section of the project, we conducted an evaluation of the relationship between specific individuals, political extremist groups, and organized crime organizations. So our focus was on 2 main categories of regional actors that were the formal military trained individuals and returned foreign fighters. So from now on, I'll refer to them as former fighters and foreign fighters. So the former fighters are defined as individuals who were or are part of state defense and security institutions that provide formal military training. So this group includes former members of the army, state police, secret services, and special forces, including those that have served in the coalition forces overseas, for example, such as NATO operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. In contrast, returned foreign fighters are individuals who have undergone informal military training, often holding religious and ideological extremist views. So the primary goal of this research was to identify specific typologies within these groups, former fighters and foreign fighters, and that are more likely to engage in political extremism or organized crime. So by recognizing these typologies, we aim to gain a clearer understanding of how individuals with military or combat backgrounds become involved in such networks. Next slide, please. So the Western Balkans have historically been a focal point for many conflicts. So this made making this phenomenon of foreign fighters not unfamiliar to the region, unfortunately. So during the Yugoslav wars, the concept of foreign volunteers evolved. So over the time, the term volunteers transitioned to labels like foreign fighters or foreign mercenaries, and the motivation also shifted towards religious and ethnic divisions. So the Western Balkans 6 region has also been a significant exporter of foreign fighters. So in the case of ISIS, for example, during the conflict in Syria and Iraq from 2012 to 2016, approximately 1,000 individuals from the Western Balkans joined ISIS, so including here women and children. We can see on this slide the breakdown of these numbers, and it is as follows. So in Albania, it is 144. Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's 240. North Macedonia is from 140 to 150. Kosovo, 445. Montenegro, 31. And Serbia, 49. So convictions for participating in foreign conflicts, particularly in Syria and Ukraine, show notable differences across the Western Balkans. For example, in Albania, 12 individuals were convicted for their involvement in the Syrian conflict, with an average sentence of about 13.24 years. Additionally, 2 individuals convicted for domestic terrorism received sentences averaging 16.5 years. In Bosnia, the situation is that there were 42 convictions out of 45 cases, an average sentence of 4 years. In Kosovo, we have 123 convictions arose from 171 terrorism-related charges, with participants in foreign conflicts receiving an average sentence of 3.5 years. However, recruiters faced much stricter penalties. The situation in Montenegro is that there were only 2 convictions related to participation in Syria and Ukraine, and both receiving 6-month sentences. North Macedonia, 29 individuals were convicted for their involvement in the Syrian conflict, averaging 5.66 years, while, for example, domestic terrorism cases averaged around 6 years. And in Serbia, 7 individuals were convicted for their participation in the Syrian conflict, averaging 9.93 years, while 16 individuals were exonerated for involvement in the Ukraine conflict. So overall, Kosovo recorded the highest number of convictions for terrorism and foreign conflict participation, followed by Bosnia and later by North Macedonia, while Albania had the highest average sentences. On the other side, Montenegro had the lowest. Notably, individuals participating in the Syrian conflict faced significantly harsher penalties than those involved in the Ukrainian conflict, so indicating a marked disparity in the judicial approach to these cases. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we will delve a little bit deeper into the criminal markets across the Western Balkans. So in Albania, the former fighters and foreign fighters are significantly involved in drug trafficking, armed robbery, contracted killings, and major haste. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, their activities lean more toward economic crimes and organized crime, but also contract killings. In North Macedonia, the involvement there is much less structured, with criminal markets heavily influenced by socio-economic instability. The criminal landscape in Montenegro is characterized by a fluid mix of legal and illegal activities, particularly in tobacco smuggling. Serbia, this country has one of the most organized criminal markets in the region, with extensive networks in drug trafficking and arms smuggling. However, there is less direct evidence connecting former fighters and foreign fighters to these activities compared to, for example, Albania and Bosnia and Herzegovina. So in summary, in Albania, former fighters are actively engaged in high-profile drug smuggling and robberies as well, while in Serbia, the criminal scene is shaped by historical connections among foreign fighters, extremist groups, and organized crime. Next slide, please. So in the Western Balkans, the nature of cooperation among groups varies significantly across countries. For example, in Albania, we can see here that the cooperation is primarily transactional, with former fighters applying their military skills in organized crime, especially trafficking, motivated mainly by financial gain rather than political ideologies. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the while financial gain drives interactions, some factions show that sympathies for right-wing ideologies, and this related to the Ukraine conflict. So this may suggest that there is a blend of profit-driven motives with ideological influences. The situation in Kosovo is more complex, and it is marked by nationalist hostility and also deep-seated ethnic tensions. And this linking this cooperation to political extremism rather than financial motives, as we had in the previous two countries. In North Macedonia, there is no direct evidence of links to political extremism. Cooperation among radicalized groups indicates a mix of ethnic accusations, but also right-wing rhetoric, suggesting potential ideological alignments. And the situation in Montenegro is multifaceted, driven by financial incentives, but also historic conflicts hint at possible ideological influences and organized crime. And lastly, but not the least, Serbia. In Serbia, there's a strong connection that exists between political extremism and organized crime, as, for example, right-wing groups collaborate with criminal organizations to promote ethno-nationalism, but also blending ideology with criminal activities. Next slide, please. So in the following two slides, we will see that the threat levels for each of the countries. For example, Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia have a moderate threat level, while Bosnia and Herzegovina, as well as Kosovo, show a moderate to high threat level, while Serbia has a high threat level. So in conclusion, each country faces unique challenges at the intersection of military personnel, but organized crime and radicalization. So, however, there are common themes that highlight the need for maybe more comprehensive strategies that focus on retention, reintegration, and community engagement, and also a collaborative approach is needed to address the socio-economic and political factors that contribute to radicalization and to strengthen the capabilities of security and law enforcement agencies. So that is all from myself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Almedina. Thank you very much to all three of you for your presentations. I'm sure that everyone would agree that today we covered some very interesting topics. We highlighted the significant threats posed by both violent extremism and organized crime, emphasizing this often hidden but rather complex interplay between them. We heard that there is different levels of intensity of this interplay, different levels of violence they use. There are differences also across the countries. So what stood out for me is the need to actually analyze these threats and monitor the trends in conjunction, so together rather than separately. And the use of organized crime lens while looking into these extremist activities, it is quite a novel approach, but I hope that it will continue to be used. And this analysis it's not only about the analysis, it's also the implications that this analysis has for policy and practice. I believe it's really significant. We haven't had time to touch much upon the recommendations, and if there is time, I would like to ask maybe our panelists to briefly touch upon policy implications. But before I impose my own questions, I see that we had quite a few questions in the Q&A box, so I will just first read them. Question for Ruggiero, first one. Do you think there is a similar dynamic between the level of interactions of Serbian ultra groups like Partizan with organized crime and the recent investigations in Italy on the criminal dynamics of ultra groups in Milan?
Thank you for your question, Dario.
Sorry, just apologies. This was a question from Dario. I'm not sure I would pronounce the.
I can do that for you.
Thank you.
The answer is absolutely yes. There are similar dynamics which go beyond not only the case of Milan with the assassination of, I would say, a representative of an 'Ndrangheta family by one of the leaders of the ultras group supporting Inter Milan. There are certain dynamics for sure which overlap, and in fact, it is important to say, as far as football hooliganism and organized crime a relationship nexus is concerned, which, by the way, is the topic of a report that Sasha and I have authored 2 years ago, exactly on this topic. It's titled "Dangerous Games," and I would encourage you, Dario, to also have a look at that. Exactly in the context of that study, we argue that definitely we studied, of course, the situation in the Western Balkans, but in the introduction as well, we argue that this is definitely not a phenomenon which characterizes only our region of reference. There are examples everywhere in the world, from Brazil to Argentina to Italy, of course, and other parts of the world. It is important, though, as far as this specific case, this comparison is concerned, that at least is my very personal opinion, while there are dynamics which are certainly similar, what I would say is probably what make the case of Belgrade and Partizan particularly, but also Red Star fans, differ in a way from the Italian case, is the level of political and institutional protection that in the case of Belivuc actually enjoyed in Belgrade, something that in a way ultras from Milan don't really enjoy. Probably on one case which more on point is instead the case of Rome, so the Lazio case of Fabrizio Piscitelli, aka Diabolic, which was himself the nexus between violent extremism and organized crime. So he was a ultras, a neo-fascist, and also in control of certain drug trafficking dynamics. This is to answer to your question. I also wanted to answer to the question by Odd, which was actually instead answered in chat by Sasha, if I may, Vanya. Okay.
Sure, please go ahead. Yes, I actually wanted to address that question to all three of you. It's quite interesting, and it can, please go ahead.
It's interesting because, I mean, first of all, this research, given that we approach the violent extremism phenomenon from the organized crime angle, so through the lens of organized crime, in a way that the journey was full of surprises, which led us to a number of observations in itinere, but also after the conclusion of the research. One thing that I probably would like to say here is that although the research focuses on far-right extremist groups, at some point we felt the need to clarify the nature in general, to clarify the situation about subjects that would be in a way too simplistic to include in the far-right realm. So we basically needed to come up with another category of subjects, which, by the way, is well explained in the report, which is ultranationalism. So while in Western Balkan societies, nationalism is traditionally associated with radical right and far-right groups, in the Western Balkans, differently from mainly, I would say, Western Europe, it appeared in a way too reductive, because in the region, if it is true that all far-right people are nationalists, it is also true that not all nationalists are instead far-right. For example, when conducting fieldwork and interviews on far-right extremism, it became evident that while nationalism is often discussed as a political ideology in the wider Balkan region, in particular in Albanian-speaking regions, the essence of nationalism appeared to lie in inquiries into personal identity and affiliation to some sort of like at a psychological level, I would say, up to the point that a word, for example, like patriotism, would be used almost interchangeably with the word nationalism. So to conclude, while this report relies on the association of nationalism with far-right ideologies, in the case of Albanian, so to say, ethno-nationalism, contrasting with the concept of ultranationalism really helped us to better understand why, for example, far-right extremism as such seemed to be almost a non-issue for most of the experts that were identified and interviewed.
Thank you. Sasha, would you maybe want to just briefly also state some of the surprises along your journey while researching? You did answer in the chat box, but maybe some haven't read. So just briefly, please.
Yeah. So basically, I think like what was mostly interesting is like that web of network of different companies that actually be identified for the far right group, more or less, which is not the case for the religious extremism. So, and how they actually use money from budget. So basically, money of citizens to like to implement their activities. But so just to understand, it's also very important right now. Like the budget of far right groups is much more bigger than the budget of the religious extremism, like individuals and supporters. But there is, but in the end, it's not. We cannot say that actually they use all the money for the far right activities or for the promotion of far right activities that they actually have. But in a way, if they want to do something more like strategic or much more substantial, so there is like a much more chances like for the far right groups than the religious extremism in the Western Balkans to conduct their activities. So everything depends in the end about the political situation and the stability of the in the region. But right now, we can say that actually some patterns from the Europe and the rise of far right idea can be also identified in the region, especially in some countries.
Thank you, Sasha. The next question comes from Marika Ferri from European Union Drug Agency. And the question was to all, what would be your recommendations, and specifically in to prevent youngsters, so recruitment of young people into organized crime, but I would also say slash violent extremist groups from the point of this research, right? So this kind of touches upon my question that I wanted to raise, like the policy implications. So what are the recommendations? What policymakers, what we as civil society can do better? Ruggero, would you maybe like to start?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting topic, because at the end of the day, this is what matters, right? It's the new generations and whether we can sort of limit the problem looking forward. Now, it's interesting when we compare the motives to join specific groups, and we put on the one side organized crime and we put on the other side violent extremism. When it comes to organized crime, it's definitely profits. No, it's easy money. You join a specific drug trafficking networks, you join a specific whatever organized crime groups, because this is always a fast way to get money. On the other side, instead, if you join a violent extremist group, it's because there is some political, religious, or any other ideological motivation behind it. The problem is that when you have an interaction, so when you have both motives, or at least motives coming from both sides, then it's basically a terrible cocktail. So you not only have the possibility to make money fast, but you also are joining because you have also an ideology behind it. So definitely really goes back to addressing root causes of marginalization in society. It goes back to intervening in those areas where most of the recruitment take place. And I know that for example, Al-Medina can talk about initiatives to counter this, for example, in Montenegro, because we recently had a meeting there exactly on this topic.
Yeah, so just to jump in maybe shortly. So from the meeting in Podgorica that we had last week, we also had, I also asked one of the participants there, like, what do you think, what are the best approaches to how to stop youngsters to join organized crime groups and such activities? And it was interesting that mostly all of them said that we need better programs and a better connection, and maybe better cooperation between the state institutions, civil society organizations, but also and to include the youngsters and to make their voices heard, and to see what are their needs and what do they need in order to stay away from these specific problems. So critical thinking, active involvement in youth initiatives, also a better understanding of their needs is very much needed for in order to have them out of criminal activities.
Thank you all. So, Sasha, I also wanted to hear you, but I apologize that I will have to cut you. It's only because we really have a strict time to finish this webinar, because the other panels are following ours. So I just have a minute to thank you all. Thank you to my panelists, the authors of the report, the whole research team, our researchers that really worked hard over the last year to collect data, to help us in making this possible. There was one question at the beginning about, are the reports already there? No, but please just be patient, and they will be published in the upcoming months. The first one will be Ruggiero's report, the baseline study on the links, which is expected by the end of the year, and the next two will follow in the beginning of next year. Thank you to our audience that really that joined us today. Thank you for all your questions. Please feel free to write to us, to our team, and we will be happy to discuss with you, and of course share with you the reports once they are published. Big thank you to our donor, the government of Netherlands, for their generous support, in wanting to understand more about this issue and supporting us in really making this research possible and getting to this knowledge. And this will be all from us. Thank you very much once again. See you for some of the next panels. Goodbye.